Richard Nixon once proclaimed that no event in American history is more misunderstood than the Vietnam War. It was misreported then, and it is misremembered now. Rarely have so many people been so wrong about so much. Never have the consequences of their misunderstanding been so tragic. In this PowerPoint, you will be responsible for analyzing the 5 key W's to the Vietnam War, and hopefully you can clear up some of the misreporting. By the end of this presentation, you should know who, what, where, when, as well as the why to the Vietnam War. Beyond these big 5 W's, you will be responsible for the following objectives. What countries were involved in the Vietnam War? What were they fighting over? What was the stereotypical demographic of the American soldier in Vietnam? Why did the United States get involved? What event escalated the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War? What was the United States public's view of being involved in the war? And lastly, what is the significance of the Vietnam War Memorial? During the 1960s and 1970s, the United States decided to get involved with a conflict that was being fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. While these two countries were the key players, many other countries decided to aid these two independent countries in hopes of gaining something from this shift in the overall world dynamics. Assisting North Vietnam was the Viet Cong, Soviet Union, or modern-day Russia, North Korea, and the People's Republic of China. Coming to the aid of South Vietnam was the following countries: the United States, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, New Zealand, the Khmer Republic, Thailand, as well as the Kingdom of Laos. From a broad perspective, it was not only two countries that were fighting, but two different ideologies. While North Vietnam was and still is communist today, South Vietnam fought hard to maintain their democratic independence. Beyond just the countries involved, it's important to know the actual demographic of the American soldier. The average age of the GI in Vietnam was 19 years old. In relation to total casualties, 11,465 soldiers that were killed in action were less than 20 years old. From a larger demographic perspective, 88.4% of the men who actually served in the Vietnam War were Caucasian, 10.6% or 275,000 were black, and 1% belonged to the other races category. Out of the 58,148 members who were killed in Vietnam, the average age was 23 years old. The Selective Service System of the United States conducted 2 lotteries to determine the order of call to military service in the Vietnam War for men born from 1944 to 1950. Nonetheless, many of the American public were confused as to how so many boys that left to fight in the war returned as messed up men, if they returned at all. While the U.S. involvement eventually came about in the 1960s, the war itself was a long time in the making. The Vietnam War arose out of more than a century of foreigners' occupation of Vietnam. After hundreds of years of struggle, the Vietnam War turned into a war for Vietnamese independence. Unfortunately, the independence that North Vietnam was looking towards was drastically different from what the South had in mind. While many in the United States were upset at our involvement because they saw this conflict as a civil war between two competing philosophies, mainly communism versus democracy, the American government felt otherwise. Their justification will be explained more later in the PowerPoint.
So bye-bye, Jenny. They sending me to Vietnam. This is a whole other country.
Like many, you may be asking yourself, where in the world is Vietnam anyways? Vietnam is a country with a large population which is located in the continent region of Asia. Countries near Vietnam include Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Macau, and the biggest cities and towns in Vietnam include Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, and Haiphong. As seen on this picture presented, the 17th parallel was very important in the Vietnam War. It was this imaginary line that separated North Vietnam from South Vietnam. More importantly, it was this line of latitude that separated the conflicting ideologies of the communist North Vietnam and the democratic South Vietnam. Through this picture, you will also notice that a majority of the fighting took place in South Vietnam. which makes sense considering that North Vietnam invaded, trying to force and impose its ideologies onto the South. From the beginning, and even to the present, the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War has been shrouded in utter ambiguity. In 1964, the United States government was looking for a pretext to escalate the U.S. involvement in the war. The USS Maddox was gathering information and intelligence off of the North Vietnamese coast when it was fired upon, although no damage was done to the ship. The Pentagon reported the incident as an unprovoked attack, and Congress fabricated a second attack 2 days later. Just behind the present war in Iraq, the Vietnam War is the second longest war America has ever been involved in. The actual fighting that the U.S. was involved in with the Vietnam War was between the years of 1964 and 1973. One of the biggest questions still today that many ask is, why did the United States get involved? Wasn't this just a civil war? The main reason for the United States' involvement, as proclaimed by the U.S. government, was a fear that communism would spread through Asia. China had become communist in 1949, and the Korean War of the 1950s had seemed to show the spreading power and influence and threat of communism. As seen in this picture, one way to gain support for the war was to promote the notion that the only way to ensure freedom in your children's future was to stop the spread and influence of communism at the source right now. As found in Life magazine, this picture of Lieutenant Colonel James Lindbergh Hughes was heavily used to sway the American public in favor of the war. Between his bandaged head, hunched shoulders, his uniform being in shambles, and the fact that he is shoeless, this image of him being led at gunpoint could soften even the hardest of hearts. And who could forget Uncle Sam? Notoriously known for being one of the prime examples of American war propaganda, this poster, developed for the Vietnam War, appeals to your desire to be the hero and draws you in while Uncle Sam's eyes and finger constantly follow you no matter where you go. While there was a small percentage of soldiers and American citizens in favor of the war, many were adamantly and publicly against the war. Hundreds upon thousands of people throughout the course of the 9-year conflict poured out into the streets of every major city to show their dissatisfaction with the government's choice. Even during the heat of the civil rights movement, people of all ages, genders, and races joined together to show their frustration that America's youth was being forced to put their lives on hold to, as Herbert Hoover would say, to fight another old man's war. With iconic phrases like, "I don't give a damn for Uncle Sam," and "make love, not war," men burn their draft cards and women burn their bras to show a lack of support for the war. It was during the 1960s and 70s that civil disobedience grew exponentially, with not only average citizens publicly and peacefully showing their support of peace by placing flowers in the barrels of soldiers' guns, but some even going so far in other countries to harm themselves in order to get their message across. Whether it be the average high school student, mother of 3, the 40-year-old working man, and even prominent musicians like Buffalo Springfield, Bob Dylan, Edward Starr, Barry McGuire, and even the Beatles were all posing not only their disgust for the government, but also the major questions in everyone's mind. What is the war good for? And more specifically, why are we here? No matter what the answer to this extensively ambiguous question, respect must be paid to those who fought and died during this war. While all gave some gave all in the Vietnam War. And this is why the Vietnam War Memorial was constructed. Completed in 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial stands as a symbol of America's honor and recognition of the men and women who served and sacrificed their lives in the Vietnam War.
I saw you standing there. Man, you look different with that silver in your hair. Me, I haven't aged a bit. Still
inscribed on the black granite walls are the names of more than 58,000 men and women who gave their lives or remain missing. Yet the memorial itself dedicated to honor the courage, sacrifice, and devotion to duty and country of all who answered the call to serve during the Vietnam War.
We were proud to serve our country when called by Uncle Sam. Then more than a little anxious when they shipped us off to Nam. Remember all the heat and bugs.
The Three Servicemen statue is the result of the controversy surrounding Maya Ying-lin's design of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Some veterans and the political supporters felt that the wall was a giant tombstone, so the statue was a more heroic, lifelike depiction of a soldier.
But it's a wall of love, a wall that heals, a wall that touches, helps you feel the faces of more than 50,000 names. Feel the wall be forever changed.
The National Veterans Art Museum in Chicago, Illinois, has a unique tribute to the war called Above and Beyond by Richard Steinbach and Ed Broderick, which commemorates all the men and women who died in the Vietnam War. Dog tags with name, date of death, and branch of service for each individual hang in formation, shoulder to shoulder, beginning with the first person killed and ending with the last.
The names here on the wall. It's a wall of love, a wall that heals, a wall that touches, helps you feel the faces of more than 50,000 names. Feel the wall be forever changed.
Much like the protest of the 60s and 70s, roughly 3 million people from all over the United States and the world flock to this place of peace, closure, and remembrance each year to pay homage to those brave young men who fought to defend our civil liberties that many of us take for granted today. While they are merely names on a wall, to many of today's generations, they are more than a name on a wall. Fathers, brothers, uncles, and husbands laid their lives on the line to allow for freedom to reign. The rest of those that go before us cannot settle the unrest of those to follow, but historical amnesia is unacceptable, especially in America's youth. Gone, but never forgotten.